Wolves want to sign Dwight Mcneil in January to help keep them in the Premier League. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the things that I like about Dwight Mcneil, the things that I really dislike about Dwight Mcneil, and whether I think he would be a good or a bad signing for Wolves. Now, thank you for the support on the videos recently. We are only 100 subscribers away now from 3,000 subscribers. This was a goal that I set at the start of the year, way before I even started uploading daily and uploading consistently on this channel. So I'd very much appreciate it. If you're not already, you would subscribe to the channel. I'd very much appreciate that. There's 67% of you who aren't subscribed who watch these videos, so I'd very much appreciate it. And let's get straight into this one. Now, of course, Dwight Mcneil is a Premier League experienced wide man. He can play off the left, he can play off the right, he can play as a number 10. And generally, he has done that over the last 5 or 6 years, really, in Premier League level, of course, at Everton and Burnley. And I really liked him at Burnley, but the one thing that I've always said about Dwight Mcneil is he's just not a finisher. He's not going to score you a ridiculous amount. But in terms of creating stuff, he is absolutely capable of that. We've obviously seen it at Burnley and Everton. And he is a player that was very exciting when he came through at Burnley. Obviously played for England at youth level as well. And generally, he had a lot of promise. But ever since he's been at Everton, especially the last, I'd say, probably 2 years, to be honest, it's felt very much like they've needed to move away from Dwight Mcneil because ultimately, he was one of them players that was very steady. He was going to be useful in keeping Everton in the division when they were fighting to stay in the division. Obviously, their targets and goals have changed now. So Dwight Mcneil, for me, has probably moved on from Everton's level, and he's nowhere near Everton's level in my personal opinion. I don't think if Everton want to move forward as a club, they can't pin all their hopes on him. Now, would he be a good signing for Wolves? It's a tough one. It's not as simple as that. Now, he is good in terms of the fact that, like I say, he can play anywhere across those front three positions. So if Wolves did want to go to a 3-4-1-2 and have Tolu and Strand Larsen as those two strikers, he could play as the central 10. If they wanted to go to a 4-2-3-1, he could play as the right 10 or the left 10. If they wanted to play a 4-3-3, he can play off the left, he could play off the right. So he is malleable. He definitely is tactically malleable, and that's one thing I do like about Dwight Mcneil. I think he's tactically malleable. I think when you look at his ability on both flanks, it is very decent, but for me, it's not overly inspiring. I think Dwight Mcneil would be great at a high-end championship side. I think he'd work really well at a high-end championship side. But whether he is Premier League quality currently or in general remains to be seen. Obviously, he's struggled with injuries last few years as well, and he hasn't played as much as perhaps Everton fans would have liked. And there was a period as well at Everton where he was brilliant, and he goes through spells and spurts. And when you need to stay in this division, you cannot have players that are not consistent week in, week out. Hence why John Arias has come under fire a hell of a lot so far, because he had an unbelievable performance against Spurs, and either side of that, he's been pretty diabolical, to be honest. So I think there is a lot of issues with Dwight Mcneil, and I've just wanted to highlight a few of them in a bit more depth, to be honest. Now, as you can see on the screen, and as I briefly just mentioned, he does struggle with injuries, and as I've said, you need players that are readily available, consistently fit, and, to be quite honest, a consistent performer. And, of course, Wolves have got a lot of players that either fall short in one of those categories or a few of those categories. But luckily, they do still have a few players that fit into a lot of those categories. Now, Andre, very available. João Gomez, very available. And they are both very, very consistent when they do play. I think Hugo Bueno, again, for me, someone that feels quite available, to be honest. I think maybe that's just this season, but, you know, he's been very consistently available for Wolves. Krejci, again, a player that doesn't pick up a ridiculous amount of injuries. You know, at Wolves, he has in the past, which is a concern, but not at the moment. He hasn't picked up anything, and to my knowledge anyway. And I think you do need players around that. I think Dwight Mcneil, because he's injured so much, first of all, that is a bit of a mad decision, of course. I think the fact that he is so one-dimensional is a concern. I think Dwight Mcneil, yes, while he's good at his, you know, he's a good presser. I think he'll run his socks off, and that's one thing that I do like about him, and we will speak about in a minute. But he's so heavily reliant on his 1 foot. Now, as I've said, he is malleable and he can play off the right, through the middle, and off the left. But in terms of his heavy reliance, on his left foot, it's very, very concerning. I think it's always been the case, whether you've watched him at Burnley, you've watched him at Everton, you've watched him at England youth level, you very rarely see him take a strike on his right foot. You just don't. And I think it's not a huge issue if he is excellent with his left foot all the time, but unfortunately he's not. Now, One of the things he's excellent at, and I genuinely believe he is excellent at, is his delivery. I think he's really decent from a set piece. I think his corners, I think that would help Wolves, and Wolves aren't very strong from set pieces anyway. I think his ability to shoot from outside the box is a promising thing, and I think that's one thing Wolves don't do enough, and they don't really have in this side. So I think if you were to have a high presser like Dwight Mcneil, perhaps in front of a pivot of Joao Gomez and Andre, it could work, but you would need Dwight Mcneil to be back to his best, and he looks absolutely miles off that, to be honest. Of course, he's only 25, so I wouldn't write that out completely, but again, it's one of them. It's a lot of ifs, buts, and maybes for Dwight Mcneil. Now, the deal itself looks like it would be a loan anyway, so Wolves wouldn't have to put any money down, but I highly doubt that Everton would take that offer if there was no obligation, or at least an option to buy, or an obligation if he played X amount of games for Wolves, for example, or Wolves stayed in the division. I think Everton would be daft not to take that, because ultimately there's not going to be many suitors for Dwight Mcneil, in my opinion, and I think if they could force Wolves into a deal, they'd be smart to, but from a Wolves perspective, it'd be absolutely diabolical. Now, as I say, he's great from distance, and I do think his set-piece delivery is very, very good. I do have a lot of doubts about Dwight Mcneil, as I said. I think the fact he's so one-footed, huge concern. I think his general sort of demeanour isn't the most inspiring in terms of, he's often plays with his head down, and he's quite negative. For a player that presses a lot, weirdly, he has that quite negative demeanour and a sort of body language when you watch him on the pitch. I don't know if that could just be for Everton, of course, but it did feel like that in his final season at Burnley as well. But again, both sides have been struggling since he's been there, of course. And again, he is Premier League experience, which is a good thing to like, but I don't think it's enough quality. It's okay needing experience, and Wolves, in my opinion, absolutely need experience in January. Now, of course, this link is coming about as well because he is homegrown, of course, a great thing for Wolves to get, but I believe they can get better quality homegrown players. It's whether they can get better quality homegrown players within their budget that will also want to come to a side that are bottom of the table quite comfortably. So there are a lot of risky factors. I think for the level Wolves are at, I can see why people are optimistic about it, but for me, it feels very, very strange. Now, this is one of the ways we could see Dwight McNeil line up for Wolves. Now, my big criticism of Wolves this season is the ball's not been in the box anywhere near enough. I think if you give Strand Larsen service, he scores. And that may seem controversial. People are getting on to Strand Larsen. I get it, because he's not showing, you could argue, enough fight, enough passion, enough determination really at the start of the season. But it just shows when you give him service, he scores. Ultimately, the only time he got service against West Ham, he scored. Very rarely had service since. Of course, I think he should do better against Chelsea with that chance off the left. But even for Norway, of course, the other night, a really well-taken goal. And he is clearly a good footballer. We've all seen it. So I don't buy into this lazy narrative that he's all of a sudden a bad footballer, wants to move and doesn't care. Now, for me, I think this is where you could see a huge opportunity for Wolves with Dwight McNeil if they were to bring him in. I think Hugo Bueno off that left-hand side, notoriously a good delivery, and again, no one's been utilising that enough this season. Bueno's got a great cross on him from a full-back, and that was one of the main positives we saw about him before he went on loan to Feyenoord the season prior to that. And I think when he was at Feyenoord again, I was really impressed with his deliveries, especially when you watch some of the sort of balls he was putting in that weren't getting finished as well. I'd recommend you go and watching some of them, and I'm sure you can find a highlight reel on YouTube as well, because he has some really, really nice crosses on him. So for me, Bueno's not been utilised enough, and I think there's a massive opportunity. I think Dwight McNeil, if he was to play on this left-hand side, would link really well with Hugo Bueno. I think they both offer such a good delivery into the box on that left-hand side, and I think that's probably the most likely place where we'll see him if he did come in at Wolves, of course, because John Arias says, and people say John Arias is the best off the right-hand side. Yet, it remains to be seen if he's even the best at anything, to be honest, but I do think he probably will play off the right-hand side, and I think Rob Edwards will take a lot of stock into that, but I do think if Dwight McNeil could play in this area, and they could get service into the middle for the likes of Strand Larsen or Tolu Orakadara, of course, as well. Another very big aerial threat, another striker that I think would dominate aerially and would feed very well off balls in from Hugo Bueno and Dwight McNeil. I think that's a real threat. Feels very old school, but ultimately Wolves have got to win dirty. We've seen it this season. Leeds and Burnley have picked up ugly wins, and unfortunately Leeds and Burnley are absolutely dreadful and will both go down this season as well. People may disagree with me. I'm still absolutely adamant that happens. So I do think traditional football, we've seen it a lot more in the last few years. We've seen the likes of a Chris Wood thriving at Nottingham Forest. We've seen the likes of a Jean-Philippe Mateta, who is a bit more mobile. But again, he thrives off long balls, thrives off second balls, thrives off crosses into the box, and thrives generally in his overall build-up play. And for me, that's what Larsen has to do more. I do think he'd build up well with the likes of Dwight Mcneil on that left-hand side. But again, I think it's a risk. Now, you could also go for the likes of John Arias off the left, or you could have a Hwang Hee-chan. I personally wouldn't, but you could. And then you could have Dwight Mcneil off the right. And again, a similar situation. Rob Edwards likes his number 10s to be able to receive the ball on the half turn, to be able to drift inside, and Dwight Mcneil off the right would do that really well. I think Dwight Mcneil would work well with the likes of a Jackson Tachua overlapping down this right-hand side, getting into these areas. Dwight Mcneil would receive the ball in here and make things happen. I think they'd cause a bit of a threat. I think also with Dwight Mcneil's pressing, I think he would be useful to this front line. I think there is positives to look at, and I don't want this video to come across negative, because it's not, I'm not saying he's a dreadful footballer and he can't be saved. We've seen plenty of players go to other clubs and revive their career. We saw Jesse Lingard do it. Yes, it was in, lockdown, but we've seen that happen. We've seen plenty of players go to other clubs and look like a completely different football. We often see it when players move from the Premier League to another league. They look absolutely outstanding. So I think it's very, very interesting to see what happens. I do think Dwight Mcneil would work well here. And I do think, to be fair, if they were to go a bit traditional with it and say it was good to go to a back four, maybe, let's just say, for example, you'd have Andre and Joao Gomez as that 2, you'd have a number 10 in there, and you'd have someone off the right-hand side, you could have Dwight Mcneil there, or, as I say, you could take, of course, Krejci out in this situation. I wouldn't be taking him out of the lineup at all, but you could have the likes of a Fer Lopez on the right-hand side, and then you could have Dwight Mcneil sitting as this 10, and he could play that 4-2-3-1, of course. Obviously, there is a centre-back out of position here, and I will put one in eventually, but that is essentially, how I would see it, of course. So you'd have it almost, of course, Bueno would be deeper, Totti would move across, Bueno would move across, Jackson Tachua would move back in there, and then you'd almost make that 4-2-3-1 with a number 10 being Dwight Mcneil in this pocket. So I do think there is a lot of ways that Wolves could play if they did bring him in, but I want to break it down and conclude this video in a more balanced way as well. Now, Dwight Mcneil, I'm not saying he's a bad footballer. I don't think he's an awful signing when it comes to Premier League homegrown experience. Wolves need homegrown players. I want to make that abundantly clear, and there will be a video out on that very soon as we approach the January transfer window. But I do think, with regards to his wages, I think he's on a relatively decent wage at Everton, to be honest. Of course, he was quite an important asset to them back then. I think it depends on the wage split. I think it depends on if there is an obligation to buy. I would not be getting into any of that at all. Definitely not. I would stay away from that. If it's a complete out-and-out loan and the wages are somewhat covered, I think Wolves could explore it. I think you could do far worse than a good presser, someone that, like I say, has that delivery, but you do need more than Dwight Mcneil to keep you in this Premier League. It's a simple fact, and Dwight Mcneil is nowhere near good enough on his own, so they do need to build players around him. Dwight Mcneil, for me, I would be on the side of not signing Dwight Mcneil, to be quite honest, as a neutral. But as Wolves fans, let me know what you think in the comments. I really want to hear it, because I think there's been a lot of divide on Dwight Mcneil across Twitter, across social media this week, and I think it's very interesting to hear the angles from both sides. So if you did enjoy this video, as I said, it's 67% of you watch these videos who aren't subscribed. We are less than 100 subscribers away from 3,000, which was my absolute dream at the start of the year, and it never even seemed like a possibility considering I wasn't uploading, but it would be an absolutely incredible achievement, so thank you all for that. I hope we can reach it. If we could reach it before the end of November, that would be an absolute joke, and we'll go for another goal. But if not, I thank you for the support anyway. 2,900 subscribers is no mean feat. Thank you all for watching this video, and I'll see you all tomorrow.